Rammohun Roy, greater, however, than the influence exercised on the philosophical thought of modern Europe has been the impulse which these same Upanishads have imparted to the religious life of modern India. In about the same year, 1774-1775, when the first MS of the Persian translation of the Upanishads was received by a witty Rammohun Roy was born in India, the reformer and reviver of the ancient religion of the Brahmins, a man who in his youth could write a book against the idolatry of all religions, and who afterwards expressed in so many exact words his belief in the divine authority of Christ, was not likely to retain anything of the sacred literature of his own religion, unless he had perceived in it the same divine authority which he recognized in the teaching of Christ. He rejected the Puranas. He would not have been swayed in his convictions by authority of the laws of Manu, or even by the sacredness of the Vedas. He was above all that, but he discovered in the Upanishads and in the so-called Vedanta something different from all the rest, something that ought not to be thrown away. The Soma and the key to its foundational revival to bring it into a different state, but tapping into something, a trace look on loose, to go back to Siberia to look for the Soma root in language that points it out and elaborates its proofs in terms of a substance around which its entire sublimation is installed and pre-installed into its use, proving that the secondary substance is already in its use of language, its own sublimation to the technique, which is why there's always a creation of language that always goes like, oh yeah, I recognize this, but Lacan makes it something different, which you might think he's aiming towards sobriety, but he's likely aiming towards sublimation, the source of the primary usage that doesn't content the dramatic teachers of Lacanian tradition in terms of its non-Lacanian approach, but yeah, the psychology in this one would be great, but the dramatic heritage be more of the Socratic dialectic sort, so the ambition sort of gets displaced and the need to make up for what they find in others is still not being negated proper. So I stay there finding a source of my negation in others, and I believe that myself is in its use outside of where it's listened to in its spectrum, that the secondary substance as a proof in its own remainder outside of all units of measure, which means its return is also there as a form that's syntactically, if you will, predestined to its own shape in terms of its own syntax and its units to put it together in that way. So it's not the pleasing sound of Shakespeare's poetry is redeeming to the ear that seeks to hear it more than the words it adds to the repertoire, adds a capacity to say those things that are simpler in terms of the fascinating byproduct that the complex creates of the simple by making it easy to explain. Crystallization is in this process found something providing un usufruit au capitalisme qu'il faut pousser en bénéficiant et se voir extérioriser de sa propre contiguïté pour formaliser une critique tout autre de cette forme, faire en sorte que l'élaboration de son contenu en est valorisée et même primordial à sa déterminité, c'est-à-dire en fonction de ses désirs qu'il ne peut atteindre, propre du déni kleinier de la coupure fait semblant, c'est-à-dire à condition de se reconnaître comme capable de le produire. C'est bien la fonction analytique qui produit le sensible comme tel, et non la sensibilité qui en crée une fonction d'émence pour produire l'émence comme tel qui fait sa déterminité incomplétude du monde, comme si le discours ramenait fonction sexuelle de ce qui ne peut être déterminé à travers ce qui est vraiment désiré, ce qu'il comprend. La fonction de fuite est ce qui est le plus néfaste et si critiquable de cette incomplétude. Présenter, c'est à peu près tout ce qui peut se voir comme obligé de nier la présentation de ce qui est personnel à ta propre structure, fonction de Freud à l'extérieur même, à reprendre sur l'effet de confiance pour supporter la contrepartie qui risque de revenir sur l'ennemi circonstanciel. Il y a une sensibilité qui est mise, mais en même temps, elle en dépend pour en jouer, ce qui est important pour moi. En tout, je m'en joue et je fais tout mon possible pour m'assurer que la jouissance de cette partie en est dans son état parfait, qui ne termine pas les formes et ses contreparties à l'extérieur, comme à venir ou même supposer savoir, mais démence non formée de ta structure, non la tienne, mais que c'est supposé autre que toi qui devrait l'être pour viser autre chose, une stabilité propre et une organisation qui peut maintenir la science comme externe à son contenu et non de l'être comme absolu, mais désir autre que s'atteindre à nos relations sexuelles qui basent toute structure déterminée, compréhension à suivre. Something that, if rightly understood, might supply the right native soil in which alone the seeds of true religion, aye, of true Christianity, might spring up again and prosper in India. Up lifespan, huge increased gap of inducing and penetrating the instance of the insistence that should be a proper political endeavor. If there's a real that's impossible, the fact that some idiot posited a collective archetype in the unconscious as a formal mechanism to something that can be induced means that we have to run away from the ideals that we produce by running further into them and seeing why and how they're desirable, but how in their desirability they're insufficient to produce the capital gains from the sex its life produces if it's compensated with, which means there's a possibility of not excluding jouissance, and by it, this speech mechanism, free association, produces the best mistake possible. Even in delirious speech, even in pretending and reaching the absolute pretend of that same person you're trying to represent does not make A equal A. But in terms of what is here, a different topic of its accord, might spring up again and prosper in India, as they had once sprung up and prospered from out the philosophies of Origen or Synesius. European scholars have often wondered that Rammohun Roy, in his defense of the Veda, should have put aside the Samhitas and the Brahmanas and laid his finger on the Upanishads only, as the true kernel of the whole Veda. Historically agité, m'imagine être capable de se faire sujet de facial whatever nerves broke down and literally make a liturgical turn outside of your huge political. And Gabriel Tupinamba is the child of that effort in terms of what he produces as a really ethical position in terms of psychoanalysis. You know, you're forced in the clinic to still pay this analyst that you feel you don't have to pay anymore, and that sometimes the desire of the analyst fixes in terms of what he didn't have the theory to work through. But I struck him enough with bizarrities of nonsense that I believe I deciphered my capacity to reach that backwardly.
Yeah.
I can't interpréter. Only as a true kernel of the whole Veda, historically, no doubt, he was wrong. For the Upanishads presuppose both the hymns and the liturgical books of the Veda. But as the ancient philosophers distinguished in the Veda between the Karma Kanda and the Gnana Kanda, between works and knowledge, as methods of action and strict fashions of contending towards the opposite in terms of what you can see and use to make your life more than astonishing, which means engaging your surprise and your desire, making desire something totally other than what it is represented to be in the first place, canceling its own definition out, using the Shimas, of course, traversing their style, Karma Kanda, and the Gnana Kanda, between works and knowledge, at the limits of as they themselves pointed to the learning of the sacred hymns and the performance of the sacrifices as a preparation only for that enlightenment, which was reversed as the highest reward for the faithful performance of all previous duties. A Rammohun Roy, like Buddha and other enlightened men before him, perceived that the time for insisting on all that previous discipline with its minute prescriptions and superstitious observances was gone. While the knowledge conveyed in the Upanishads, sort of Vedanta, enveloped, though it may be in strange coverings, should henceforth form the foundation of a new religious life, he would tolerate nothing idolatrous, not even in his mother, poor woman, who after joining his most bitter opponents, confessed to her son before she set out on her last pilgrimage to Juggernaut, where she died, that she was right, he was right, but that she was a weak woman and grown too old to give up the observances which were a comfort to her. It was not, therefore, from any regard of their antiquity or their sacred character that Rammohun Roy clung to the Upanishads, that he translated them into Bengali, Hindi, and English, and published them at his own expense. It was because he recognized in them seeds of eternal truth, and was bold enough to distinguish between what was essential in them and what was not. A distinction, as he often remarked with great perplexity, which Christian teachers seemed either unable or unwilling to make. The death of that really great and good man during his stay in England in 1833 was one of the severest blows that have fallen on the prospects of India. But his work has not been in vain. Like a tree whose first shoot has been killed by one winter frost, it has broken out again in a number of new and more vigorous shoots, for whatever the outward differences may be between the Adi Brahmo Samaj of Debindranath Tagore or the Brahmo Samaj of India of Keshub Sundar Sen, or the Sadharan Brahmo Samaj. The common root of them all is the work done once for all by Rammohun Roy. That work may have disappeared from sight for a time, and its present manifestations may seem to many observers who are too near not very promising. But in one form or another, under one name or another, I feel convinced that work will live. In India, Schopenhauer writes, "Our religion will now and never strike root. The primitive wisdom of the human race will never be pushed aside there by the events of Galilee. On the contrary, Indian wisdom will flow back upon Europe and produce a thorough change in our knowing and thinking." Here, again, the great philosopher seems to me to have allowed himself to be carried away too far by his enthusiasm for the less known. He is blind for the dark sides of the Upanishads, and he willfully shuts his eyes against the bright rays of eternal truth in the Gospels, which even Rammohun Roy was quick enough to perceive behind the mists and clouds of tradition that gathers so quickly round the sunrise of every religion.